My name is Willow Birdhowl, and I want to tell you about the winter I realized I had become invisible to my own children. It was December 30th, 3 days after Christmas, and I was sitting in my kitchen watching the snow fall outside my modest two-bedroom home in suburban Ohio. The silence was deafening. My phone sat on the scratched wooden table, its screen black and lifeless. No missed calls. No text messages. Nothing. Christmas had come and gone without a single word from my two adult children, David, 38, and Claire, 35. Not even a card. I'm 60 years old, and I suppose some people might think I look older than my years, especially lately. I'd let my auburn hair grow out gray at the roots, wore the same faded sweaters year after year, and hadn't bothered with makeup in months. Why would I? There was no one left to see me. But here's what my children didn't know, what I had never told them. I had $33 million sitting in various investment accounts, earning interest every single day. You're probably wondering how a woman who looks like she shops at thrift stores and counts coins at the grocery checkout could have accumulated such wealth. Well, that's a story for later. Right now, I want you to understand what it feels like to be forgotten by the people you brought into this world. 8 years ago, my husband Robert died of a sudden heart attack. He was 55, vibrant, successful. One day he was kissing me goodbye as he left for work, and 12 hours later, I was identifying his body in a hospital morgue. The grief nearly destroyed me, but what came after, the slow, painful realization that my children saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience, that nearly finished the job. In those first months after Robert's death, David and Claire were attentive. They helped with funeral arrangements, sorted through their father's belongings, made sure I was settled. But as the seasons changed, so did their attention. The phone calls became less frequent. The visits stopped altogether. And then came the woman who would steal what little family I had left. Her name was Veronica Sterling, and she was everything I was not. Before we continue with Willow's story, I want to remind you that your story matters too. If you've ever felt invisible or taken for granted by family, you're not alone. Hit that like button if Willow's story is resonating with you, and share this video with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't determined by how others treat them. Now, let's see how Veronica entered the picture. Veronica Sterling swept into our lives like a perfectly coiffed hurricane 2 years after Robert's death. She was 50, blonde, and possessed the kind of confident beauty that comes from expensive procedures and even more expensive clothes. She had met David at some corporate networking event. She worked in luxury real estate, selling million-dollar homes to people who collected houses like handbags. I'll never forget the first time David brought her to Sunday dinner. She arrived in a white Lexus that probably cost more than most people's houses, wearing a dress that hugged her surgically enhanced figure like it was painted on. Her jewelry caught the light from every angle, and her smile was so white it was almost blinding. "Mother," David said, and I noticed he'd started calling me that instead of Mom lately. "I'd like you to meet Veronica. We've been seeing each other for a few months now." Veronica extended a perfectly manicured hand, her grip firm but brief, as if she was afraid my ordinariness might be contagious. "Willow, I've heard so much about you," she said, though her tone suggested she'd heard very little and was perfectly fine with that. Claire arrived 20 minutes later with her husband Mark and their 2 young children, Tommy and Sarah. I watched as Veronica immediately commanded the room's attention, regaling everyone with stories about celebrity clients and exotic vacation destinations. My grandchildren were mesmerized by her sparkly jewelry and designer handbag that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 6 months. During dinner, I served the pot roast I'd been making for family gatherings for decades. Veronica pushed the food around her plate delicately, taking tiny bites while discussing the benefits of her personal trainer and nutritionist. When dessert came, my famous apple pie that Robert used to say was better than his mother's, she politely declined, patting her flat stomach. I just don't eat sugar anymore, she announced. It's poison for the skin. I watched my children hang on her every word, nodding along as if she was sharing the secrets of the universe. When had they stopped looking at me that way? When had my wisdom become outdated and my stories become boring? After dinner, as I was clearing dishes, I overheard Veronica in the living room with David and Claire. Your mother is sweet, she was saying, but this house, it's so dated. And she seems a bit. She paused, searching for the right word. Stuck in the past, don't you think? David's response cut through me like a blade. Yeah, we've been worried about her. She doesn't really do anything anymore. Just stays home, watches TV. We think she might be depressed. They were talking about me like I wasn't in the next room. Like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. From that day forward, Veronica became a fixture in my children's lives. Within 6 months, she was included in every family gathering, every holiday celebration, every milestone moment. And with each passing event, I became more of a spectator and less of a participant in my own family story. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. David started visiting Veronica's penthouse apartment instead of coming to my house. Claire began calling Veronica for advice about everything from childcare to home decorating. My grandchildren started asking when Aunt Ronnie was coming to visit, their young faces lighting up in ways they never did for me anymore. But the real shift happened during Tommy's 7th birthday party. I arrived with a homemade birthday cake, chocolate with vanilla frosting, decorated with little toy cars because he loved vehicles. When I walked into Claire's backyard, I saw that Veronica had already set up an elaborate dessert table with professionally made cupcakes, a candy station, and a towering birthday cake shaped like a race car that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Oh, Grandma Willow, Claire said when she saw me standing there with my simple cake. How thoughtful. We can put that in the kitchen for later. Later never came. My cake sat untouched on the counter while children and adults alike marveled over Veronica's display. I watched her hold court, accepting compliments and praise for her incredible generosity and amazing taste. She was wearing a diamond bracelet that caught the sunlight like captured stars, and I couldn't help but notice how my children kept glancing at it admiringly. That night, as I drove home alone with my untouched cake on the passenger seat, I made a decision that would change everything. I was tired of being invisible. I was tired of being treated like a burden. And I was especially tired of watching this woman waltz into my family and claim the love that should have been mine. But I wouldn't fight fire with fire. I wouldn't throw tantrums or make demands or beg for attention. No, I would do something much more devastating. I would wait. I would watch. And I would remember everything. The annual gift-giving parade began in earnest during Veronica's first Christmas with our family. I should have seen it coming, but I was still naive enough to believe that my children's love for me was deeper than their fascination with her glamorous lifestyle. Christmas Eve dinner was held at David's house, a beautiful colonial he'd bought with his wife Jennifer before their divorce 3 years earlier. Jennifer, sweet Jennifer, who used to call me every week just to chat, was now relegated to picking up the children for custody exchanges. In her place sat Veronica, radiant in a red silk dress that probably cost more than most people's rent. The gift exchange started after dinner. I watched, increasingly uncomfortable, as David and Claire presented Veronica with box after beautifully wrapped box. First came a cashmere scarf from Italy. Because you mentioned loving Italian fabrics, Claire gushed. Then David handed her a small velvet box containing diamond earrings that sparkled like captured starlight. These are too much, Veronica protested, but her protests were theatrical at best. She held them up to her ears, tilting her head so the diamonds caught the light. They're absolutely perfect. My grandchildren, Tommy and Sarah, watched with wide eyes as the parade continued. A designer handbag from Claire. A spa weekend package from David. A bottle of champagne that cost more than I spent on Christmas dinner for all of us. Finally, it was my turn. I reached into my simple tote bag and pulled out the small wrapped package I'd brought for Veronica. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf I'd made myself, soft wool in a beautiful sage green that I thought would complement her eyes. The room fell silent as she unwrapped it. She held it up, and I could see her trying to summon enthusiasm for something so obviously homemade, so clearly inexpensive. "Oh, Willow," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "How thoughtful. Handmade gifts are so personal." The way she said personal made it sound like a dirty word. But the real humiliation came when it was time for my gifts. From David, I received a generic gift card to a department store, the kind of gift you give to a distant acquaintance whose preferences you don't know. From Claire, a scented candle in a scent I was allergic to, still bearing the clearance sticker from the drugstore where she'd obviously grabbed it at the last minute. "Sorry, Mom," Claire said without looking at me. "I've been so busy with the kids and work. I kept meaning to get you something special." Meanwhile, Veronica's gifts were thoughtfully chosen, expensive, presented with elaborate explanations about why each item was perfect for her. My gifts were afterthoughts, obligations fulfilled with minimal effort and even less care. But it was Veronica's response that crystallized everything for me. As I opened my meager gifts, she reached over and patted my hand like I was a charity case. "Oh, Willow, dear," she said, her voice saccharine sweet. "You're so lucky you don't care about these fancy things. Material possessions just aren't important to some people, are they?" The implication was clear. I wasn't worth the fancy things because I wasn't the kind of person who deserved them. I was simple, plain, content with scraps because scraps were all I was worth. I smiled. Actually smiled. "Yes," I said quietly, "lucky." If only they knew that the simple woman sitting in their midst had more money than all of them combined. If only they knew that I could have bought every gift in that room without checking my bank balance. If only they knew that their precious Veronica's entire lifestyle was built on credit cards and loans, and the kind of financial desperation that keeps people awake at night. But they didn't know. And I wasn't going to tell them. That night, as I sat in my modest kitchen eating leftover turkey and thinking about diamond earrings and cashmere scarves, I realized something important. My children weren't just neglecting me. They were actively choosing someone else. They were investing their time, money, and emotional energy in a woman who had known them for less than 2 years, while the woman who had raised them, loved them, and sacrificed for them sat forgotten in the corner. The hurt was so deep it felt like drowning. But underneath the hurt was something else, something harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous. I was getting angry. If you're feeling angry on Willow's behalf right now, you're not alone. Sometimes the people who should love us most are the ones who hurt us deepest. But Willow's story is just getting started, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Make sure you're subscribed because this journey is about to take some incredible turns. Now, let's see how Willow began to plan her response. Let me tell you how a grieving widow from suburban Ohio accumulated $33 million without anyone noticing. When Robert died, he left me well provided for, but not wealthy. His life insurance policy paid off our mortgage and left me with about $200,000, enough to live modestly for several years if I was careful. What Robert didn't know was that I had always been good with numbers, good with patterns, good with seeing opportunities that others missed. I had grown up poor. My father was a mechanic who drank too much, and my mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. I learned early that money wasn't just about having it. It was about understanding it, respecting it, making it work for you instead of the other way around. When I married Robert, I handled all our finances while he focused on his engineering career. He trusted me completely, never questioning my decisions, never asking to see the books. After his death, I threw myself into investing with the single-minded focus of someone who had nothing left to lose. I started small, buying undervalued properties in neighborhoods that I researched obsessively. I spent my days driving around, talking to residents, studying development plans, understanding which areas were poised for growth. While my children thought I was just aimlessly wandering in my grief, I was building an empire. The first property I bought was a small duplex in a declining neighborhood for $30,000. Everyone thought I was crazy, including the realtor, who practically begged me to reconsider. But I had noticed something others hadn't. The city had quietly approved plans for a new medical complex just 6 blocks away. Within 2 years, that duplex was worth $90,000. I sold it and bought 3 more properties with the profits. I became obsessed with the stock market, spending hours each day researching companies, reading financial reports, studying market trends. I had a gift for spotting companies on the verge of breakthrough moments, small biotech firms developing promising drugs, technology companies with patents that would prove valuable, renewable energy stocks before they became trendy. I bought low and sold high, reinvesting every profit, watching my accounts grow day by day. But here's the thing about accumulating wealth quietly: it requires discipline that most people don't have. I lived in the same modest house, drove the same 10-year-old car, shopped at the same discount grocery store. I wore clothes until they fell apart and cooked dinner at home every night. To anyone watching, I looked like exactly what I appeared to be: a grieving widow living on a fixed income, counting every penny. The irony wasn't lost on me that as my bank account grew, my children's attention diminished. The more money I had, the less they seemed to think I was worth their time. They saw my frugal lifestyle and assumed I was struggling financially. They saw my simple clothes and modest home and concluded that I had nothing of value to offer their increasingly sophisticated lives. I could have corrected their assumptions at any time. I could have shown them my investment portfolio, taken them to dinner at expensive restaurants, bought them the kinds of gifts they were showering on Veronica. But I didn't, and as the months passed, I realized I was conducting an experiment I hadn't consciously planned. I was learning who my children really were when they thought I had nothing to give them. The results were devastating and illuminating in equal measure. When I needed help moving some heavy furniture, they were too busy. When I mentioned feeling lonely, they suggested I join a senior center. When I invited them to dinner, they found excuses to decline or showed up late and left early. But when Veronica needed something, anything, they appeared like genies from a lamp, eager to please, desperate to be useful. I watched them buy her expensive gifts while giving me dollar store trinkets. I watched them hang on her every word while barely listening to mine. I watched them include her in family photos while I stood off to the side, forgotten. And with each slight, each dismissal, each moment of being treated like an afterthought, my resolve grew stronger. The funny thing about silence is that it tells you everything you need to know about people. Give them enough space, enough time, enough rope, and they'll show you exactly who they are. They'll reveal their priorities, their values, their capacity for love and loyalty and basic human decency. My children were failing the test spectacularly, but I was patient. I had learned patience from years of watching investments mature, from waiting for the right moment to buy or sell, from understanding that the biggest rewards come to those who can delay gratification. I would wait. I would watch. I would remember. And when the time was right, I would act. By the 3rd year after Robert's death, my investment portfolio had grown to $15 million. By the 5th year, it was $25 million. By the time Veronica entered our lives, I was worth more than $30 million and growing richer every day. But I still wore the same faded sweaters. I still counted coupons at the grocery store. I still lived in the same modest house with appealing paint and dated furniture. Because I had learned something valuable about human nature. People will show you their true selves when they think you have nothing they want. And my children, my own flesh and blood, had shown me that their love was conditional, their loyalty was for sale, and their respect could be bought by anyone with a designer handbag and a pretty smile. It was time to start planning my response. 3 years into Veronica's reign as the queen of my family, I began to notice the first cracks in her perfect facade. It started small. A comment here, a gesture there, tiny inconsistencies that most people wouldn't notice, but that I, with my newfound obsession with observation, catalogued carefully. The first crack appeared during Easter dinner. Veronica arrived in a stunning new outfit, a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, paired with shoes that clicked authoritatively across my daughter's hardwood floors. But when she thought no one was looking, I caught her discreetly checking her phone with an expression of barely concealed panic. "Everything all right?" I asked innocently, refilling her wine glass. She snapped the phone shut quickly, her brilliant smile never wavering. "Oh, just work stuff. You know how it is in real estate. Always something urgent." But her laugh was a beat too long, a note too high. The second crack appeared a few weeks later when I was grocery shopping. I spotted Veronica's white Lexus at the pawn shop on Elm Street. Through the window, I could see her arguing with the clerk, gesturing emphatically at something she was trying to sell. When she emerged 20 minutes later, her designer handbag was noticeably lighter, and the large gold bracelet she usually wore was gone. I ducked behind a parked car until she drove away, my mind racing. Pawn shops weren't places that successful real estate agents typically frequented unless they were desperate for quick cash. The third crack was the most telling. David had mentioned that Veronica was house hunting for herself, something about wanting to upgrade from her rented penthouse to something she owned. But when I called the luxury real estate office where she supposedly worked, the receptionist told me that no one by the name of Veronica Sterling had ever been employed there. Curious, I decided to do some digging. It's amazing how much information you can find about someone when you know where to look and have the time to look thoroughly. I hired a private investigator, a thorough, discreet woman named Patricia who specialized in financial backgrounds. What Patricia discovered was fascinating. Veronica Sterling wasn't her real name. She was actually Veronica Kowalski from Cleveland, and she had a history of living far beyond her means. She had been evicted from 3 apartments in the past 5 years, had defaulted on 2 car loans, and had a credit score so low that she couldn't qualify for a store credit card at most retailers. The penthouse apartment she claimed to own? Rented, and she was 3 months behind on payments. The luxury car? Leased, and the payments were delinquent. The designer clothes, the expensive jewelry, the lavish lifestyle she flaunted so effortlessly, all of it was built on credit cards, personal loans, and what appeared to be a sophisticated system of check kiting that was about to collapse under its own weight. Veronica Sterling was a house of cards in a windstorm, and the winds were picking up. But here's what made it even more interesting. My children had no idea. They continued to fawn over her, continued to buy her expensive gifts, continued to treat her like some kind of financial guru whose lifestyle they should aspire to emulate. They saw the designer labels and assumed success. They saw the confident demeanor and assumed competence. They saw the luxury car and assumed wealth. They never looked deeper because they didn't want to. The fantasy of Veronica was more appealing than the reality of their mother. I began to watch more carefully, looking for signs of the impending collapse. They weren't hard to find once I knew what to look for. The nervous way she checked her phone during dinner. The excuse-filled explanations for why she couldn't contribute to expensive group gifts anymore. The subtle changes in her wardrobe, still designer labels, but now from outlet stores and clearance racks rather than boutiques. The way she steered conversations away from her work or her living situation whenever anyone asked direct questions. One evening, I was leaving Claire's house after babysitting my grandchildren when I saw a tow truck pulling up to Veronica's Lexus in the driveway. I watched from my car as they loaded it onto the flatbed despite her frantic protests and pleas for more time. David came out to see what the commotion was about, and I heard Veronica spin a story about a clerical error with her lease company, how it would all be sorted out in the morning, how these things happen to successful people all the time because of complex financial arrangements. David bought every word. He even offered to drive her home and help her straighten out the confusion the next day. That's when I knew that the time for waiting was almost over. Veronica's financial house of cards was collapsing, and when it fell, it would take everyone around her down with it, including my children, who had invested so much of their emotional and financial energy in supporting her lifestyle. But I had a different plan. Instead of watching my children get swept away in Veronica's inevitable downfall, I was going to be the one controlling the demolition. It was time to stop being a spectator in my own family's drama. It was time to take action. And I knew exactly where to start. The plot is thickening, isn't it? Willow is about to make her move, and trust me, you won't see this coming. If you're on the edge of your seat right now, smash that like button and share this video with someone who loves a good story of justice served cold. We're just getting to the good part, so make sure you stay tuned. Now, let's see how Willow begins to weave her web. There's an art to revenge that most people never master. They think it's about dramatic confrontations and public scenes, about shouting matches and slammed doors. But real revenge, the kind that changes lives permanently, is quiet, methodical, and absolutely devastating in its precision. I began my campaign on a Tuesday morning in October, sitting in my modest kitchen with a cup of coffee and a laptop computer that my grandchildren had taught me to use. They thought I was just learning to get online to stay connected with the world. They had no idea I was about to use that connection to systematically dismantle someone's life. My first move was to buy Veronica's debt. Patricia, my private investigator, had provided me with a comprehensive list of Veronica's creditors. Credit card companies, personal loan providers, the finance company that held her car lease. All of them were owed money that Veronica couldn't pay. What most people don't realize is that when someone defaults on their debts, those debts don't just disappear. They get sold to collection agencies for pennies on the dollar. I became a very good customer of several debt-buying firms. Working through a series of shell companies that Patricia helped me establish, I began purchasing Veronica's outstanding debts one by one. Her maxed-out Visa card with a $15,000 balance? I bought it for $3,000. Her defaulted personal loan of $25,000? Mine for $5,000. The lease on her Lexus that she couldn't afford? I now own the right to collect on that too. The beauty of this approach was its invisibility. Veronica had no idea that her various debts were slowly consolidating under one umbrella, my umbrella. To her, they were still scattered obligations to different companies, managed by different collection agencies, creating chaos that she was desperately trying to juggle. But I wasn't done. Patricia had also discovered that Veronica was renting her penthouse apartment through a property management company that was, coincidentally, looking to sell some of their properties to private investors. The building where Veronica lived was hemorrhaging money due to maintenance issues and problem tenants. I bought the entire building. It took 6 weeks to complete the purchase through one of my shell companies, but suddenly I was Veronica's landlord. The woman who had been treating me like a charity case for 3 years was now living in a property I owned, 3 months behind on rent she couldn't afford to pay. The irony was delicious, but I wasn't savoring it yet. This was just the foundation. The real structure I was building would be much more elaborate. Next, I began attending the same social events where Veronica networked. The luxury real estate community in our city wasn't that large, and it wasn't difficult to insert myself into their circles once I started dressing the part and dropping hints about my investment portfolio. Suddenly, I wasn't just Willow Berthal, the forgotten mother. I was Willow Berthal, the mysterious wealthy investor who had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. At these events, I listened carefully to conversations about market trends, property values, and most importantly, which real estate agents were struggling to make their numbers. I learned about commission disputes, failed deals, and professional rivalries. and I began to plant seeds. I've been looking for a really sharp agent to handle some of my properties, I mentioned to several people, but I need someone with an impeccable reputation. I've heard some concerning things about agents who oversell their success. I can't afford to work with someone who's not financially stable themselves. I never mentioned Veronica by name, but in a gossipy industry like real estate, word travels fast. Soon, people were whispering about agents who drove cars they couldn't afford and wore clothes that exceeded their commissions. People began looking more closely at the gap between lifestyle and actual success. Meanwhile, I was also working more directly. As the owner of Veronica's various debts, I had the legal right to demand payment. But instead of sending threatening letters or making harassing phone calls, I did something much more sophisticated. I began to coordinate collection efforts. Where Veronica had previously been dealing with random, scattered demands for payment from different companies, she now found herself facing a systematic campaign. Payment demands arrived on the same days. Court notices were filed simultaneously. Credit reports were updated in concert. The effect was like watching a slow-motion explosion. Veronica's carefully constructed facade of success began to crumble under the coordinated pressure. She couldn't get new credit to pay old debts. She couldn't refinance existing obligations because her credit score was in free fall. She couldn't even qualify for a basic checking account at most banks. And through it all, my children continued to support her, continued to believe her increasingly desperate explanations, continued to shower her with expensive gifts they couldn't afford while ignoring their mother who sat quietly in the corner, watching everything unfold with the patience of a spider in its web. The most beautiful part was that none of it was illegal or even technically unethical. I was simply exercising my rights as a creditor and property owner. I was collecting debts that were legitimately owed, enforcing contracts that had already been broken, and making business decisions that any reasonable investor would make. The fact that these actions were systematically destroying the life of the woman who had stolen my family's affection was just a pleasant side effect. By Christmas of that year, Veronica was in full crisis mode. Her financial situation had deteriorated so rapidly that she was making obvious mistakes, taking desperate measures, showing the kind of panic that comes from watching your entire world collapse around you. But my children still didn't see it. They were so invested in the fantasy of Veronica's success that they couldn't recognize the reality of her failure, even when it was happening right in front of them. That's when I realized that buying her debt wasn't going to be enough. If I wanted my children to see the truth about the woman they had chosen over their own mother, I was going to have to create a moment where the truth couldn't be ignored. I was going to have to orchestrate a finale that would strip away every illusion and leave nothing but the ugly reality beneath. It was time to force Veronica into bankruptcy. The bankruptcy notice arrived on a gray February morning, delivered by certified mail to an address where Veronica Sterling no longer lived. She had been evicted from my building 3 weeks earlier, though she had managed to keep that fact hidden from my children by claiming she was house-sitting for a friend while her penthouse was being renovated. I knew about the notice because, as her primary creditor, I received copies of all legal documents related to her case. I also knew that she would try to handle this disaster the same way she handled everything else, with lies, manipulation, and desperate attempts to maintain her facade of success. What she didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment for months. The bankruptcy filing itself was inevitable. When you own someone's debts and coordinate collection efforts efficiently, you can create a financial crisis that leaves them with no other legal options. Veronica had reached the point where her monthly obligations exceeded her monthly income by a factor of 3. She was borrowing money to pay minimum payments on credit cards she was using to pay rent on properties she couldn't afford while buying clothes to maintain an image that was bankrupting her. It was a house of cards, and I had systematically removed every supporting beam. But filing for bankruptcy and having that filing approved are two different things. The court has to review all debts, all assets, all financial relationships to ensure that the bankruptcy is legitimate and not an attempt to defraud creditors. This process takes time, requires documentation, and involves public hearings where creditors can object to the proceedings. I had been very much looking forward to those hearings. The first sign that David and Claire were aware of Veronica's crisis came during Sunday dinner at David's house. I had started attending these family gatherings regularly again, not because I was welcome, but because I wanted a front row seat to the drama I had orchestrated. Veronica looked haggard. Her usually perfect hair was slightly unkempt. Her designer outfit was one I had seen her wear several times before, and she was wearing costume jewelry instead of the real diamonds my children had bought her. But more telling than her appearance was her demeanor. The confident, commanding presence that had dominated our family gatherings for 3 years was gone, replaced by nervous energy and barely concealed desperation. "I have some news," she announced during dessert, her voice wavering slightly. "I've decided to restructure my business operations. Sometimes successful people have to make strategic financial moves that might look concerning to people who don't understand high-level finance." David leaned forward, concerned. "What kind of restructuring?" "Well," Veronica continued, twisting her hands in her lap, "I'm going through a temporary legal process to reorganize my debts and investments. It's very common among successful entrepreneurs. Donald Trump did it several times." Claire, ever supportive, reached over and squeezed Veronica's hand. "That sounds smart. You're always so good at managing money." I almost choked on my coffee. "The thing is," Veronica continued, "there will be some court proceedings, just formalities really, but I might need some moral support. These legal processes can be overwhelming even when you know they're the right business decision." "Of course we'll support you," David said immediately. "Whatever you need." "When are the hearings?" Claire asked. "Next month, March 15th. Veronica's voice was barely above a whisper. I smiled into my coffee cup. March 15th was going to be a very interesting day. Over the next few weeks, I watched my children rally around Veronica with the kind of devotion I had once hoped they would show me. They researched bankruptcy law to help her understand the process. They offered to loan her money for legal fees. They assured her repeatedly that they didn't judge her for making smart business decisions. David even offered to attend the hearing with her as moral support, though Veronica quickly declined, claiming that having family members present might complicate the legal proceedings. She was right about that, though not in the way she thought. The night before the hearing, Claire called me for the first time in months. "Mom, I wanted to let you know that Veronica is going through a difficult time right now. She's having to make some tough business decisions, and we're trying to be supportive. I know you two haven't always gotten along perfectly, but I hope you can understand that she's important to our family now." "I understand perfectly," I told her. And I did. The morning of March 15th was crisp and clear, the kind of day that makes you believe good things are possible. I dressed carefully for the occasion, not in my usual thrift store clothes, but in a tailored navy suit I had purchased specifically for this moment. I looked like what I actually was, a successful businesswoman with the confidence that comes from real wealth, not the desperate fake-it-till-you-make-it energy that Veronica had been radiating for months. I arrived at the courthouse early and took a seat in the back of the courtroom, far enough away that Veronica wouldn't notice me immediately, but close enough to see every expression that would cross her face during the proceedings. The hearing began promptly at 9 o'clock. Veronica sat at a table with a court-appointed attorney who looked like he was handling his 15th bankruptcy case that week. She was wearing a black dress that I recognized from 2 previous family gatherings, and her hands were shaking as she shuffled through papers. The trustee, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, began reading from Veronica's filing. The list of debts was extensive and damning: credit cards, personal loans, unpaid rent, medical bills, even money owed to a dog groomer. As each debt was read aloud, Veronica seemed to shrink further into her chair. But then came the part one had been waiting for. The court recognizes several objections filed by creditors in this case, the trustee announced. We'll hear from the primary creditor first. That was my cue. I stood up slowly, smoothed my suit jacket, and walked toward the front of the courtroom. Every eye in the room followed me, including Veronica's. The moment she saw me, her face went white as paper. Your Honor, I said, my voice clear and confident. My name is Willow Berthal, and I represent Berthal Holdings LLC and its subsidiary companies. We hold approximately 80% of the debts listed in Ms. Kowalski's bankruptcy filing. I heard Veronica gasp. She had never heard her real name spoken in public before. The trustee looked at her papers, then back at me. Ms. Berthal, you're listed here as the primary creditor. Do you wish to object to this bankruptcy filing? I do, Your Honor. But before I explain my objections, I think it's important for the court to understand the full scope of Ms. Kowalski's financial deception. For the next 20 minutes, I systematically dismantled every lie Veronica had told about her life, her career, and her financial situation. I presented documentation showing that she had never been employed by the luxury real estate firm she claimed to work for. I showed evidence that she had been living under an assumed name to avoid previous creditors. I demonstrated how she had used new credit to pay old debts in an elaborate shell game that had finally collapsed. But the most devastating moment came when I revealed the extent of my ownership of her debts. Your Honor, through my various holding companies, I now own Ms. Kowalski's credit card debts, her personal loans, the lease on her vehicle, and the building where she was living until her recent eviction. In essence, every financial obligation that brought her to this courtroom today is now owed to me. The courtroom was dead silent. Veronica was staring at me with an expression of absolute horror, as if she was seeing a ghost. The trustee was reviewing the documentation I had provided, her eyebrows rising higher with each page. Ms. Berthal, the trustee said finally, this is highly unusual. Are you saying that you deliberately acquired these debts? I'm saying that I made a series of business investments that I believed would be profitable. The fact that they all happen to involve the same debtor is coincidental. Of course, it wasn't coincidental at all, but I had been very careful to ensure that every transaction was legal and properly documented. The trustee turned to Veronica. Ms. Kowalski, do you have any response to these allegations? Veronica tried to speak, but only a strangled whisper came out. She cleared her throat and tried again. I don't understand how this is possible. Mrs. Berthal is just she doesn't have money. That's when I delivered the final blow. Your Honor, I'd like to submit additional documentation showing my current financial status, as it's relevant to my ability to collect on these debts. I handed the trustee a folder containing bank statements, investment portfolios, and property deeds. As she reviewed them, her expression shifted from confusion to amazement. Ms. Berthal, these documents show assets worth $33 million. Approximately, yes. A murmur went through the courtroom. Veronica looked like she was going to faint. Your Honor, I continued, I want to be very clear about something. This woman has spent the past 3 years inserting herself into my family, convincing my children that she was successful and sophisticated while treating me like I was poor and irrelevant. She accepted expensive gifts from my children while they gave me dollar store trinkets. She made them believe that her lifestyle was something to aspire to while my modest way of living was something to pity. My voice remained calm, but I could feel the power of the moment building. My children chose her over me because they thought she had something valuable to offer them. They thought her wealth and success made her worthy of their love and attention in ways that I was not. I want them to understand exactly who they chose and exactly what they rejected. The trustee was staring at me now, and I could see understanding dawning in her eyes. So, yes, Your Honor, I object to this bankruptcy filing. Not because I expect to collect these debts. frankly, the money is meaningless to me. I object because I want it on the public record exactly who Veronica Kowalski really is. I want my children to see the court documents. I want them to understand that everything they believed about her was a lie, and everything they assumed about me was wrong. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Ms. Kowalski, the trustee said, "Do you have legal representation for these proceedings?" Veronica shook her head, tears now streaming down her face. "Then I'm going to continue this hearing for 30 days to allow you to obtain proper counsel. Given the complexity of the creditor relationships involved, this case will require additional review." As the gavel fell, I gathered my papers and walked toward the exit. As I passed Veronica's table, she grabbed my arm. "Willow, please," she whispered desperately. "You don't understand. I never meant for things to go this far. I was just trying to survive." I looked down at her hand on my arm, then met her eyes. "Veronica," I said quietly, "you spent 3 years teaching my children that love is conditional, that respect can be bought, and that a person's worth is determined by their bank account. Congratulations. You were absolutely right." I pulled my arm free and walked out of the courtroom, leaving her sobbing at the defendant's table. But the real drama was just beginning, because I knew that within hours, my children would learn everything that had happened in that courtroom. And for the first time in 3 years, they would be forced to confront the truth about both Veronica and me. Can you believe what just happened? Willow has just pulled off one of the most calculated revenge plots I've ever heard, and we're not even at the climax yet. If your jaw is on the floor right now, hit that like button and share this video because this story is about to reach heights you won't believe. Don't go anywhere. We're about to see how David and Claire react to learning the truth. This is getting intense. The phone call started before I even made it home from the courthouse. My cell phone was ringing as I walked through my front door, David's name flashing on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again immediately. Then Claire called. Then David again. By the time I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, I had 17 missed calls and a voicemail box that was full. I didn't listen to the messages. I didn't need to. I could imagine exactly what they contained. Confusion, desperation, and the dawning realization that everything they thought they knew about their mother and their precious Veronica had just been turned upside down. Instead, I sat in the quiet of my modest kitchen, the same kitchen where I had planned this entire campaign of revenge, and savored the moment. For 3 years, I had been invisible, irrelevant, forgotten. Now, suddenly, I was the most important person in my children's world. The doorbell rang at 3:47 p.m. I checked the peephole and saw David and Claire standing on my front porch, both looking like they had been crying. Claire was holding a folder of papers, probably printouts of the court documents that were now public record. I took my time answering the door. "Hello, David." "Claire." My voice was calm, pleasant, as if they were ordinary visitors stopping by for tea. "Mom," David said, his voice cracking slightly. "We need to talk." "Of course."
"Come in."
They followed me into the living room, the same living room where they had dismissed my concerns, ignored my loneliness, and celebrated Veronica's presence for 3 years. Now they sat on the edge of my worn couch like they were afraid the furniture might contaminate them. Claire spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, we went to the courthouse. We got copies of the bankruptcy proceedings. We read the transcripts." "That's nice, dear." David leaned forward, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. "Mom, is it true? Do you really have $33 million? I sipped my tea and considered the question. "Actually, as of this morning's market close, it's closer to $34 million. The tech stocks have been performing very well lately." The silence that followed was deafening. Claire's voice was shaking when she finally spoke. "Why didn't you tell us? All these years we thought, we assumed." You assumed I was poor, I finished for her. You assumed I was irrelevant. You assumed I had nothing of value to offer your sophisticated lives. But we didn't know, David protested. If you had told us, everything would have been different. I set down my teacup and looked at my son, really looked at him for the first time in years. Would it, David? Would it really have been different? Of course. We would have. You would have what? Visited more often? Called more frequently? Bought me expensive gifts instead of dollar store candles. My voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. You would have treated me better because you thought I could afford to treat you better?
Claire was crying now.
Mom, that's not fair. We love you. We've always loved you. Have you? I asked. Because for 3 years, I watched you shower attention, affection, and expensive gifts on a woman who was lying to you about everything: her name, her job, her financial situation, her entire identity. Meanwhile, your mother, who raised you, sacrificed for you, and loved you unconditionally, sat forgotten in the corner because she looked poor. We didn't forget you, David said desperately. We just thought. You thought Veronica was more worthy of your time and energy because she appeared successful. You thought her lifestyle was something to aspire to while mine was something to pity. You made your choice based on what you believed people could give you, not on who they actually were. The truth of it hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. Claire was sobbing openly now. Mom, please. We made mistakes. We were wrong. But we can fix this. We can make it right. Can you? I asked. Can you really? Because Veronica didn't bewitch you with magic spells.
She didn't force you to ignore me.
She simply showed up with designer clothes and expensive jewelry, and you decided that made her more valuable than the woman who gave birth to you. David tried a different approach. Mom, we understand that you're hurt. We understand that we made mistakes. But Veronica manipulated us. She made us believe. She made you believe what you wanted to believe. I interrupted. She gave you permission to treat me the way you already wanted to treat me, like an obligation instead of a mother. The silence stretched between us, filled with years of accumulated hurt and resentment. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice broken. What do you want from us? How can we make this right? I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the modest suburban street where I had chosen to live despite being able to afford any neighborhood I wanted. I want you to understand something, I said without turning around. For 3 years, I conducted an experiment. I wanted to see who you really were when you thought I had nothing to give you. I wanted to see if your love was conditional or unconditional. I wanted to know if I had raised children who valued character or children who valued currency. I turned back to face them. You failed that test spectacularly. But we didn't know it was a test. David protested. It wasn't supposed to be a test, I replied. It was supposed to be life. Real life, where you love people because of who they are, not because of what they can do for you. Claire stood up suddenly, anger replacing her tears. This isn't fair. You lied to us too. You pretended to be poor when you were rich. You manipulated us just as much as Veronica did. Did I? I asked calmly. Did I ever ask you to buy me expensive gifts? Did I ever expect you to take me to fancy restaurants or include me in your social circles? Did I ever demand anything from you except basic human decency and the occasional phone call? She had no answer for that. The difference, Claire, is that I wanted you to love me despite thinking I was poor. Veronica wanted you to love her because you thought she was rich. I was testing your character. She was exploiting it. David was crying now too, great heaving sobs that shook his whole body. Mom, please.
We're sorry.
We're so sorry. Please forgive us. Please give us another chance. I looked at my children, my babies who had grown into adults I barely recognized, and felt something break inside my chest. It wasn't my heart. My heart had broken 3 years ago when they started treating me like a stranger. This was something else, something deeper. It was the last vestige of hope that they might somehow redeem themselves. I forgive you, I said quietly. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. What does that mean?
Claire whispered.
I looked at my children, my babies who had grown into adults I barely recognized, and felt something break inside my chest. It wasn't my heart. My heart had broken 3 years ago when they started treating me like a stranger. This was something else, something deeper. It was the last vestige of hope that they might somehow redeem themselves. I forgive you, I said quietly. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. What does that mean?
Claire whispered.
I walked to my purse and pulled out a business card, handing it to David. That's my attorney's contact information. If you need anything legal regarding Veronica's situation, he can help you. As for us, I paused, looking at the two people I had once loved more than life itself. I think we all need some time to think about what kind of relationship, if any, we want to have going forward. Mom, please, David started. I think you should go now, I said gently. I'm tired, and I need to be alone. They left reluctantly, Claire still crying, David looking like he had aged 10 years in the past hour. As I watched them drive away, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. I had won. Completely, utterly, devastatingly. But victory, I was learning, sometimes tastes more bitter than defeat. The next few weeks were a masterclass in human psychology. David called every day, sometimes multiple times, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails. Claire sent flowers, then cards, then showed up at my door with my grandchildren in tow, hoping that seeing Tommy and Sarah would soften my resolve. She was right that it was difficult to turn away my grandchildren, but she was wrong about it changing my fundamental position. The bankruptcy hearing was rescheduled and eventually dismissed when Veronica failed to appear. According to my attorney, she had left town suddenly, leaving no forwarding address. The various debts I owned would eventually be written off as losses, which I could use for tax purposes. It was a small consolation prize, but I didn't need the money anyway. What I needed was something much more valuable, acknowledgement of what had been done to me, and what that meant for all of us going forward. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday evening in April. I was reading in my living room when I heard a car door slam outside. Through the window, I saw both of my children walking up my front path. They looked terrible, haggard, exhausted, like they hadn't been sleeping well. Which, according to their voicemails, they hadn't. This time, when I opened the door, they didn't wait for an invitation. Claire pushed past me into the living room, David close behind her. They were both crying before they even sat down. Mom, Claire said, her voice breaking, we can't do this anymore. We can't sleep. We can't eat. We can't function. We know we hurt you. We know we failed you. We know we were terrible children, and we don't deserve your forgiveness. David dropped to his knees on my living room carpet, actually dropped to his knees like he was proposing or praying. Mom, please. I'm begging you. I'll do anything to make this right.
Anything.
Claire joined him on the floor, both of my adult children kneeling in front of me like penitents at an altar. We were so wrong about everything. So completely, utterly wrong. Veronica was a fraud, and we fell for it completely. We chose her over you, and we will regret that for the rest of our lives. I looked down at them. These two people I had carried in my body, raised with every ounce of love I possessed, and felt nothing. Or rather, I felt everything, but it was all tangled together in a knot I couldn't untie. Get up, I said quietly. Both of you, get off the floor. They stood reluctantly, clinging to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. Do you know what the worst part was? I asked them. It wasn't the neglect, though that was painful. It wasn't watching you lavish attention on someone else while ignoring me, though that broke my heart. The worst part was realizing that I had raised children who believed that a person's worth could be measured by their bank account. "We don't believe that," David protested weakly. "You do," I said firmly. "Your behavior proved it. You treated Veronica like a queen because you thought she was wealthy and successful. You treated me like a burden because you thought I was poor and irrelevant. When you learned the truth about our respective financial situations, your attitudes toward both of us changed immediately." Claire was shaking her head frantically. "No, Mom, that's not. Claire, you called me yesterday and offered to take me shopping for a proper wardrobe, now that you know I can afford it. David, you suggested I move to a nicer neighborhood and offer to help me look at houses. 3 weeks ago, you thought my clothes and my house were perfectly adequate for someone like me. What changed?" They had no answer because we all knew what had changed, their perception of my net worth. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued. "I'm going to finish the life I started building when your father died. I'm going to travel, invest in causes I care about, maybe buy a place somewhere warm for the winters. I'm going to live the life of a woman who has $34 million and the freedom to do whatever she wants with it. Can we be part of that life?" Claire whispered. I considered the question for a long moment. These were my children. Despite everything, despite all the hurt and disappointment and betrayal, they were still the babies I had rocked to sleep, the toddlers I had comforted after nightmares, the teenagers I had worried about when they stayed out too late. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I need time to figure out if the people you've become are people I want in my life." "But we can change," David said desperately. "We can be better. We can prove to you that we've learned from this." "Maybe you can," I agreed. "But change takes time, and trust, once broken, is very difficult to repair. I spent 3 years watching you choose someone else over me. It's going to take more than a few weeks of apologies to undo that damage." "How long?"
Claire asked.
"How long before you'll give us another chance?" I looked at my daughter, this woman who had once been my best friend, my shopping companion, my confidant. Before Veronica, we had talked every day. Before Veronica, she had asked my advice about everything from her marriage to her children's education. Before Veronica, I had been important to her. "I don't have an answer for that," I said. "But I can tell you this. Any relationship we have going forward will be on my terms. I will never again allow myself to be treated as less important than whoever else happens to be in your lives. I will never again accept being forgotten or dismissed or treated like an obligation." "We understand," David said quickly.
"Do you?"
"Because understanding and accepting are two different things. Understanding means you recognize what you did wrong. Accepting means you're willing to live with the consequences of those actions, even if those consequences are permanent." The weight of that statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. "Are you saying you might never forgive us?" Claire asked, her voice barely audible. "I'm saying that forgiveness is a process, not an event. And that process requires genuine change, not just remorse." I walked to the front door and opened it. "I think you should go now. Take some time to think about whether you're ready to do the work that real change requires." They left quietly, still clinging to each other, still crying. As I watched them drive away, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete control over my own life. For the first time since Robert died, I was exactly where I wanted to be, with exactly the people I chose to have around me, which, at the moment, was no one at all. And that felt like the greatest victory of all. Willow has just delivered one of the most powerful moments in this entire story. The image of her children on their knees, begging for forgiveness, while she maintains her dignity and strength. That's the kind of justice we all dream of seeing.
But we're not done yet.
There's still one more chapter to this incredible journey, and you won't want to miss how Willow chooses to end this story. Make sure you're still with us for the conclusion. 6 months later, I was sitting on the deck of my new oceanfront cottage in Bar Harbor, Maine, watching the sunrise paint the Atlantic Ocean in shades of gold and pink. The cottage wasn't large, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen that opened onto a living room with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the water. But it was mine, purchased with cash from an account that most people couldn't even dream of having. I had bought the place on a whim during a weekend trip in May. After decades of living in the same modest house in Ohio, I had decided it was time to live somewhere that reflected not just my actual financial status, but my emotional status as well. I wanted to wake up every morning somewhere beautiful, somewhere peaceful, somewhere that belonged entirely to me. The cottage was perfect. No memories of Robert's death. No echoes of family dinners where I was ignored. No ghosts of children who had once loved me unconditionally. Just the sound of waves and seagulls, and the kind of silence that comes from being exactly where you want to be. My phone sat on the table beside me, as it did every morning, displaying the daily calls from David and Claire that I no longer answered. They had been calling every day for 6 months, leaving voicemails that progressed from desperate apologies to angry accusations to confused pleas for understanding. I listened to them occasionally, the way you might check on a soap opera you used to watch, curious about the drama but no longer emotionally invested in the outcome. The latest messages were different, though. More resigned, more accepting of the new reality we all lived in. "Mom, it's Claire. I know you're not going to call me back, but I wanted you to know that Tommy asked about you yesterday. He wanted to know why Grandma Willow doesn't come to his soccer games anymore." I didn't know what to tell him. "I hope you're happy wherever you are. I hope you're living the life you deserve." "Mom, it's David. I've been seeing a therapist talking about everything that happened. She says I need to accept that some damage can't be undone, that some relationships can't be repaired. I guess I'm calling to say that I understand if you never want to see us again. I just want you to know that losing you has been the biggest mistake of my life." I deleted the messages without responding, as I had been doing for months. Not out of cruelty, but out of a kind of emotional self-preservation I had learned too late in life. I had spent 60 years putting other people's needs before my own, other people's feelings before my own, other people's comfort before my own. I was done with that. My new life was deliberately small and deliberately selfish. I woke up when I wanted to wake up. I ate what I wanted to eat. I spent my days reading, walking on the beach, tending to a small garden I had planted behind the cottage. I had joined a local book club where the other members knew me simply as Willow, the quiet woman who had moved up from Ohio and always brought excellent wine to meetings. I traveled when I felt like traveling. A week in Paris, a long weekend in San Francisco, a month-long cruise through the Mediterranean where I met interesting people and told them nothing about my past beyond the fact that I was a widow enjoying her retirement. The money, the $34 million that had been the catalyst for everything, sat mostly untouched in various investment accounts. I lived comfortably, but not extravagantly, spending what I needed to spend to be happy while watching the principal grow larger every month. I had hired a financial advisor in Portland who managed my portfolio with a kind of respectful efficiency that money commands. To him, I was Mrs. Berthow, the wealthy widow who preferred conservative investments and regular reports. He had no idea about the family drama that had precipitated my move to Maine. I liked it that way. I liked being unknown, being a mystery, being exactly as much or as little as I chose to reveal to anyone on any given day. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now living exactly the kind of life that Veronica had pretended to live, financially independent, geographically mobile, accountable to no one but myself. The difference was that my lifestyle was real, built on actual assets and actual investments rather than credit cards and lies. I had heard through my attorney that Veronica had surfaced briefly in Florida, trying to run the same cons on a new group of victims, but had been arrested for fraud and was currently serving 18 months in a minimum security prison. I felt no satisfaction in her downfall because I felt nothing about her at all anymore. She had been a catalyst, not a cause. The real problem had been my children's character, not her manipulation of it. As summer turned to fall and fall turned to winter, I settled into a routine that felt like the life I should have been living all along. I volunteered at the local animal shelter, fostering elderly dogs that reminded me of myself, creatures who had been discarded by people who should have loved them better. I took painting classes and discovered I had a talent for watercolors. I learned to knit properly, creating beautiful scarves and sweaters that I donated to homeless shelters. I was, for the first time in my adult life, living entirely for myself. And it was glorious. The phone rang one morning in December, exactly 1 year after that long-ago Christmas, when I had first realized how invisible I had become. I glanced at the screen, expecting to see David or Claire's name, but instead saw a number I didn't recognize. Hello, Mrs. Berthal? This is Jennifer Martinez from Coastal Maine Medical Center. I'm calling about your son, David Berthal. He's been in an accident. My blood turned to ice. What kind of accident?
Un car accident.
He's stable, but he's been asking for his mother. We found her contact information in his wallet. Can you come to the hospital? I sat in my peaceful cottage, looking out at the ocean that had become my sanctuary, and felt the weight of a decision I had never expected to have to make. I'll be right there, I said. 2 hours later, I was sitting beside David's hospital bed, watching him sleep off the pain medication they had given him for his broken ribs and fractured collarbone. Claire was in the hallway, crying softly as she spoke to his doctors. She hadn't seen me arrive and didn't know I was there. David's eyes fluttered open around noon, focusing slowly on my face. Mom? His voice was hoarse, uncertain, as if he was afraid he was dreaming. I'm here, I said simply. You came. You're my son. Of course I came. He started crying then, the kind of crying that comes from deep relief, mixed with overwhelming gratitude. I thought you'd never speak to us again. I thought we had lost you forever. I reached over and smoothed his hair back from his forehead, the same gesture I had made thousands of times when he was a child with a fever or a nightmare. You didn't lose me, David. You chose to let me go. There's a difference. Can we earn you back? He whispered. I looked at my injured son, this man who had broken my heart but who was still the little boy I had loved more than my own life, and felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, and certainly not forgetfulness, but something softer than the cold anger I had been carrying for a year. We'll see, I said. One day at a time. It wasn't a promise of redemption. It wasn't an erasure of the past year or the 3 years that had preceded it. It was simply an acknowledgement that some bonds, once forged in love, are stronger than the damage that disappointment can inflict. As I sat in that hospital room, I realized that my revenge had been complete. My children had learned exactly what they had lost, exactly what they had chosen to throw away, and exactly what that choice had cost them. They would carry that knowledge for the rest of their lives. But I had learned something too. I had learned that I was strong enough to survive their betrayal, smart enough to build a life that didn't depend on their love, and wealthy enough to live exactly as I chose to live. Whether that life included them going forward would depend entirely on whether they could prove they had learned to value the woman I actually was rather than the bank account I happened to possess. Time would tell, but either way I would be fine. Because the most important victory of all wasn't getting revenge on the people who had hurt me. It was discovering that I didn't need them to be happy. And that, I realized as I sat beside my son's hospital bed, was worth more than $34 million. And that's how Willow's incredible journey of betrayal, revenge, and ultimately, self-discovery comes to its conclusion. She didn't need a grand gesture or a public vindication. Her victory was quiet, personal, and complete. She discovered her own worth, claimed her own power, and learned that the best revenge is living well, entirely on your own terms. Thank you for joining us for another powerful story on Her True Stories. If Willow's journey resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't determined by how others treat them, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of strength, survival, and triumph. Remember, beautiful souls, you are worth more than how others value you. You are enough, exactly as you are, and you have the power to write your own story, just like Willow did. Until next time, keep telling your truth, keep finding your strength, and keep believing in your own incredible worth.